Aware of the fact that in your early work, you were, to some at least, in association with Dr. Sigmund Freud. And I know it would be of great interest to many of us to hear a little bit about how you happened to hear of Dr. Freud and how you happened to become involved with some of his work and ideas.
Well, as a matter of fact, it was in the year 1900, in December, soon after Freud's book about dream interpretation had come out, that I was asked by my chief, Professor Bleuler, to give a review of the book. I studied the book very attentively, and I didn't understand many things in it, which weren't clear at all to me. But from others parts, I got the impression that this man really knew what he was talking about. And I thought that this is certainly a masterpiece, full of future.
Yeah.
I had no idea then of ideas of my own. I was just it was just when I began my career as an assistant in the psychiatric clinic. And then I began with experimental psychology or psychopathology. I applied the experimental association method by and the same that has been applied in Grappelin's psychiatric clinic in Munich. And I had the results, and that there is a reaction, a certain reaction to a stimulus world. That is more or less uninteresting. But the interesting thing is why people could not react to certain stimulus worlds, or in an entirely inadequate way. And then I began to study these places in the experiment where the attention or the capability apparently of the test person began to waver or to disappear. And I found soon out that it is matter of intimate personal affairs people were thinking of, or which were in them, even if they momentarily did not think of them, when they were unconscious, with other words, that nevertheless an inhibition came from the unconscious and hindered the expression in speech.
Yes.
And then I, in examining all these cases as carefully as possible, I saw that it was matter of what Freud called repressions.
Yes.
I also saw what he meant by symbolization. And then I wrote a book about the psychology of dementia precox, it was called, now schizophrenia.
Yes.
And I sent the book to Freud and wrote to him about my association experiments and how they confirmed his theory thus far.
Yes.
And that is how it began, my friendship with Freud began.
Yes. Now, one of the, of course, very fundamental ideas in the original psychoanalytic theory was Freud's conception of the libido as sort of a broad psychic sexual energy.
Well, you see, in the beginning, I had naturally certain prejudices against his conceptions. And after a while, I overcame them. I could do that from owing to my biological training.
Yes.
And I could not deny the importance of the sexual instinct, you know.
Yes.
But later on, I saw that it was very one-sided. Because, you see, man is not only governed by the sex instinct, there are other instincts as well. For instance, in biology, you see, the nutritional instinct is just as important as the sex instinct. Also, in primitive societies, sexuality plays a role much smaller than food. Food is the all-important interest and desire.
Yeah.
Sex, that is something they can have everywhere. They are not shy. But the food is difficult to obtain, you see?
Yes, yes.
And so it is the main interest.
Yes.
And then in other societies, for instance, I mean, in civilized societies, the power drive plays a much greater role than sex.
Yes.
For instance, there are many big businessmen who are impotent, even, because their whole energy is going into money making.
Yes.
Or dictating the laws to everybody else.
Yes.
That's much more interesting than affairs with women. So, you see, the inferior Dr. Adolf, the younger, the weaker, naturally had a power complex.
Yeah.
He wanted to be the successful man. Freud was a successful man. He was on top, and so he was interested only in pleasure, in the pleasure principle, and while Adolf was interested in the power drive. Sure enough.
I see. In other words, you feel that it's sort of a function of his own personality to some degree.
Yeah, it is quite natural. You see, it is one of the two ways how to deal with reality. Either you make reality an object of your pleasure, if you are powerful enough already, or you make it an object of your desire to grab it.
Yes, yes.
Or to possess it.
Yes. Now, of course, some observers have thought that perhaps the patients that Dr. Freud saw in Vienna of this period were often individuals who were repressed sexually.
Oh, yes.
And that perhaps that so many of these patients having been of this type, that this may have been one thing that sort of reinforced Dr. Freud's ideas.
Well, that is certainly so. That in the end of the Victorian age, there was a reaction going over the whole world against the taboos, the sex taboos, as one call them. One didn't understand anymore properly why not. And Freud belongs into that time, a sort of liberation of the mind of such taboos. The research comes to the question of the unconscious. There things become necessarily blurred, because the unconscious is something which is really unconscious. And so you have no object, you see nothing. No. You only can make inferences, you know. And so we have to create a model of this possible structure of the unconscious, because we can't see it. Now, you see, he came to the concept of the unconscious chiefly on the basis of the same experience I had made in the association experiment, namely that people reacted. They said things, they did things without knowing that they did it or said it. And this is something you can observe experimentally in the association experiment, where people cannot remember afterwards what they did or what they said in the moment where the stimulus word hits the complex. With the reproduction, in the so-called reproduction experiment, you go through the whole list, and you will see that the memory fails where there was a complex reaction. And that is the simple fact Freud has based his idea of the unconscious on, because that is what you can see time and again, that people, for instance, make a mistake in speech, or that they say something which they didn't mean to say, that just make ridiculous mistakes, you know. There are no end of stories, you know about how people can betray themselves by saying something they didn't mean to say at all, yet in the unconscious meant him to say that thing, just that thing. For instance, when you want to express your sympathy at a funeral, you go to somebody and you say, I congratulate you. You say, that's pretty painful, you know, but that happens, and it is true. Now, this is something that goes parallel now with the whole school of the Salpêtrière in Paris. There was Pierre Janet, who has worked out that side of the unconscious reactions quite particularly.
Yes.
Now Freud refers very little to Pierre Janet. Well, I have studied with Pierre Janet in Paris,
yes.
and he has formed my ideas very much. He was a first-class observer, though he had no dynamic theory about, no psychological theory.
Yes.
It was a sort of physiological theory
yes.
Of the unconscious phenomena as a so-called abaissement du niveau mental.
Yes.
That means a certain depotentiation of the tension of consciousness.
Yes.
It sinks below the level of consciousness and thus becomes unconscious.
Yes.
Now, that is Freud's view too.
Yes.
Only he says it sinks down because it is helped, it is repressed
yes.
from above.
Yes. Yes.
Then that was my first point of difference with Freud.
Yes.
I say there are cases, in my observation, where there was no repression from above, but the thing itself withdrew.
Yes.
Those contents that became unconscious had withdrawn all by themselves.
Yes.
They were not repressed. Yes. On the contrary.
Yes. Yes.
They have a certain autonomy. There I discovered the concept of autonomy.
Yes.
And that these contents that disappear have the power to move independently from my will. Either they appear when I want to say something definite, they interfere and say and speak themselves instead of what I wanted to say.
Yes.
Or they make me do something which I didn't want to do at all. Or they withdraw in the moment where I want to use them.
Yes.
They certainly disappear.
One of the most extreme views that we have, or one of the very men that you knew around Dr. Freud, we mentioned a moment ago, Otto Rank. He spoke
Yes.
of the birth trauma. He said the actual trauma of being born would leave a very powerful impact on the ego and show itself throughout the life of the person.
I should say this is very important for an ego, that it is born.
Yeah.
Otherwise it wouldn't be. And that is highly traumatic, you know,
Yes.
when you fall out of heaven.
But will you take literally Otto Rank's position of the birth trauma as having, you might say, a psychological effect?
Don't you see, this is an event that happens to everybody that exists, that once has been born. So everybody is born, has undergone that trauma, and so the word trauma has lost its meaning.
I see. So, in other words,
it is a general fact, of which you cannot say it is a trauma.
Yes.
It is just a fact.
Yes, yes, I see.
You see, because then you cannot observe psychology that hasn't been born.
Yes.
Only then you could say what the birth trauma is.
Yeah.
And then, until then you cannot even speak of such a thing.
Yeah.
It's just a lack of epistemology.
Now, Dr. Jung, we've been talking about the early oral level, and as you pointed out, you want to look at it rather literally as sort of a hunger drive or a drive for nutrition. Now, another rather fundamental point in development of the ego, as the more or less orthodox psychoanalytic view follows, is that there is then, this is followed by another critical level, an anal level development.
Well, one can use such terminology because it is a fact that children are exceedingly interested in all orifices of the body and they are doing all sorts of disgusting things, you know.
Yeah.
And sometimes this such a peculiarity keeps on into later life, you know.
Yeah.
It is quite astonishing what you can hear in that respect. Now, it is equally true that people who have such preferences also develop a peculiar character. In early childhood, a character is already there. You see, the child is not born tabula rasa, as one assumes.
Yes.
The child is born at a high complexity,
Yes.
with existing determinants. that never waver through the whole life, and that gives the child his character already in the earliest childhood. A mother recognizes an individuality of her child, and so if you observe carefully, you see the tremendous difference even in very small children. And these peculiarities express themselves in every way. So first, the peculiarities express themselves in all childish activities, in the way how it plays, in the things it is interested in. There are children who are tremendously interested in all moving things, and in movement chiefly. Yeah. All the things you see that affect the body. And so they are interested in what the eyes do, what the ears do, how far you can bore into the nose with your finger, you know. They will do the same with their anus. They will do with their, whatever they please, with their genitals, you know. These interests express themselves in a typically childish way in children, and later on they express themselves in other peculiarities. Yeah. Which are still the same, but it doesn't come from the fact that they once have done such a thing in childhood. Yeah. It is the character that is doing it. Yes. There is a definite inherited complexity, and if you want to know something about possible reasons, you must go to the parents. So in any case of a child's neurosis, I go back to the parents and see what there is going on, you know, because children have no psychology of their own, literally taken. They are so much in the mental atmosphere of the parents, so much en participation mystique with the parents. Yes. They are imbued by the paternal or maternal atmosphere, and they express these influences in their childish way. Yeah. So, for instance, a child, take for instance an illegitimate child, they are particularly exposed to environmental difficulties, for instance, the misfortune of the mother, etc., etc., all the complications. And such a child will miss, for instance, a father. Yeah. Now, in order to compensate for it, it is just as if we were choosing or nominating a part of their body for a father instead of the father, and they develop, for instance, masturbation. Yes, yes. That is very often so with illegitimate children, that they become terribly autoerotic. Yes. Even criminal.
One of the central parts of the so-called psychosexual development in the more or less orthodox psychoanalytic theory is the so-called Oedipus complex. Yes, yes, I believe the term complex was yours originally.
Well, you see, that is just what I call an archetype. That is the first archetype Freud has discovered. The first and the only one. He thinks that this is the archetype. Of course, there are many such archetypes. You look at Greek mythology and you find any amount of them, or look at dreams and you find any amount of them. But incest was so impressive to him that he even has chosen the term Oedipus complex, because that was one of the outstanding examples of an incest complex. Yeah. And it is only the masculine form, mind you, because women have an incest complex too, but there it is not an Oedipus. Yeah. So it is something else. Yes, yes. So it is only the term for an archetypal way of behavior in case of a man's relation, say, to his mother. It also means to the daughter, because whatever he was to the mother, he will be it to the daughter too. Yes. It can be this way or that way. Yes. It depends.
So you look at, then you will accept, in other words, the Oedipus complex, but not as being the only important such influence. You will see this is just one of many fundamental,
many ways of behavior. Now you see, the Oedipus gives you an excellent example of the behavior of an archetype. It is always the whole situation. There is a mother, there is a father, there is a son, there is a whole story, how such a situation develops, and to what end it leads finally.
Yes.
And that is an archetype. You see, an archetype always is a sort of abbreviated drama. Namely, it begins in such and such a way, it extends to such and such a complication, and it finds a solution in such and such a way. That is the usual form. As for instance, you take the instinct of building a nest with birds.
Yes.
In the way they build the nest, there is the beginning, the middle, and the end.
Yes.
It is built just to suffice for a certain number of young. So, you see, the end is already anticipated. And that's the reason why in the archetype itself there is no time. It is a timeless condition where beginning, middle, and end are just the same. They're all given in one.
Yes.
Now that is only a hint to what the archetype can do, you know,
yes.
but that's a complicated question. Well, you know what a behavior pattern is.
Yes.
Now, the way in which, say, a weaver bird builds its nest, that is an inherited form in him. He will apply all certain symbiotic phenomena between insects and plants. They are inherited patterns of behavior. And so man has, of course, an inherited scheme of functioning. You see, his liver and his heart and all his organs and his brain will always function in a certain way, following its pattern. We only have a great difficulty of seeing it because we cannot compare. There are no other similar beings like man that are articulate and could give account of their functioning. If that were the case, we would know, I don't know what. But because we have no means of comparison, we are necessarily unconscious about our own conditions. But it is quite certain that man is born with a certain functioning, a certain way of functioning, a certain pattern of behavior. And that is expressed in the form of archetypal images or archetypal forms. For instance, the way in which a man should behave is given by an archetype. Yeah. And therefore, you see, the primitives tell such stories. A great deal of education goes through storytelling.
Yes.
For instance, they call in a palaver of the young men, and two older men perform before the eyes of the younger all the things they should not do. Yeah. And at the end they say, now that is exactly the thing you shall not do. Another way is they tell them of all the things they should not do.
Yeah.
None you should, like the Decalogue.
Yes.
Thou shalt not.
Yes, yes.
And that is always supported by mythological tales.
Yes.
For instance, our ancestors have done so and so, and so you shall do.
Yes.
Or such a hero has done so and so,
yes.
And that is your model.
Yes.
For instance, take the teaching of the Catholic Church. There are several thousand saints,
yes.
And they show us how, you see,
the models then become
they are models,
for the individual.
And they have their legends, and that is Christian mythology.
Yes.
In Greek, you know, there was a Theseus, there was a Heracles, models of fine men, of gentlemen, you know.
Yes, yes.
And they teach us how to behave. They are archetypes.
I see.
Archetypes of behavior. So you see, when you have lived in the primitive circumstances, in the primeval forest, among primitive populations, then you know that phenomenon. You are seized with a certain spell. And then you do a thing that is unexpected. Now, see, the archetype is a force, it has an autonomy. It can suddenly seize you. It is like a seizure.
Yeah.
So, for instance, falling in love at first sight, that is such a case. You see, you have a certain image in yourself without knowing it of the woman, of the woman.
Yeah.
Now you see that girl, or at least a good imitation of your type.
Yeah.
And instantly you get a seizure, and you're gone.
Yeah.
And afterwards you may discover that it was a hell of a mistake. Or you see, a man is quite capable, he's intelligent enough to see that that woman of his choice, as one says, not no choice, he has been captured.
Yeah.
You know, he sees that she is no good at all, that she is a hell of a business. And he tells me so, and he said, for God's sake, doctor, help me to get rid of that woman. He can't. He's like clay in her fingers. And that is the archetype. That is so-called archetype of the anima.
Yeah, yeah.
He thinks it is all his soul. Well, you know, that is a bit complicated, you know. The anima is an archetypal form expressing the fact that a man has a minority of feminine or female genes.
Yeah.
And that is something that doesn't disappear in him, that is constantly present. And it works as a female in a man. Therefore, already in the 16th century, the humanists have discovered that man has an anima.
I see. And
that each man carries his female with himself, they say it.
Yeah. And so you
that
can't...
is not a modern invention.
Yes. So
now you see, the same is the case with the animus. That is a masculine image in a woman's mind, which is not sometimes quite conscious, sometimes it is not conscious, but it is called into life the moment that woman meets a man who says the right things.
I see.
And then because he said it is all true, and he is the fellow.
Yes.
No matter what he is.
Yes. So, to infer something...
Those are particularly well-founded archetypes, those two. And there you can lay hands on the basis, as it were, of the archetype. They are exceedingly well defined.
Well, Dr. Jung, we have been discussing in some detail some of the factors in the development of the personality of the individual, and you have very kindly elaborated for us on some of your fundamental concepts. I wonder if you would mind telling us a little bit about how you construe this term, persona.
Well, this is a practical concept we need in elucidating people's relation. I noticed with my patients, particularly with people that are in public life, that they have a certain way of presenting themselves. For instance, take the doctor. He has a certain way. For instance, he has good bedside manners, and he behaves as one expects a doctor behaves. He may even identify himself with it and believe that he is what he appears to be.
Yeah.
He must appear in a certain form, unless people don't believe that he is a doctor. And so when he's a professor, he's also supposed to behave in a certain way so that it is plausible that he is a professor, you know. So the persona is partially the result of the demands society has. And on the other side, it is a compromise with what one likes to be, or with what, or as one likes to appear, say.
Yeah.
Take, for instance, a parson. He also has his particular manner, and as corresponding to the general expectation, and he behaves also in another way, combined with his persona that is forced upon him by society in such a way that also his fiction of himself, his idea about himself, is more or less portrayed or represented. So the persona is a certain complicated system of behavior which is partially dictated by society and partially dictated by the expectations or the wishes one nurses oneself.
Yes.
Now, this is not the real personality, in spite of the fact that people will assure you that that is all quite real and quite honest, yet it is not.
Yes.
Now, such a performance, or say, the performance of the persona is quite all right as long as you know that you are not identical with the way in which you appear.
Yes.
But if you are unconscious of this fact, then you get into sometimes very disagreeable conflicts. Namely, people can't help noticing that at home, for instance, you are quite different from what you appear to be in public.
Yeah.
And people who don't know it stumble over it in the end. They deny that they are like that, but they are like that. They are it. And then you don't know, now, which is the real man?
Yes, yes.
Is he the man as he is at home or in intimate relations, or is he the man that appears in public? It is a question of Jekyll and Hyde.
Yes.
Often. Yeah. It is such occasionally there is such a difference that you would almost be able to speak of the double personality.
Yes.
And the more that is pronounced, the more people are neurotic.
Yes.
They get neurotic because they have two different ways. They contradict themselves all the time, and in as much as they are unconscious of themselves, they don't know it. They think they're all one. Everybody sees that there are two.
Yeah.
And some know him only from one side, so others know him only from the other side. And then there are situations that clash, because the way you are creates certain situations with people in relations, and these two situations don't chime in. They are just dissonances.
Yes, yes.
And the more that is the case, the more the people are neurotic.
Now, you also use the term self.
Yes.
Now, the word self, then, would this have a different meaning than, say, ego or...
Oh, yes, oh, quite, oh, yes. You see, when I say self, then you must not think of I, myself, because that is only your empirical self, and that is covered by the term ego.
Ego, yes.
But when it is matter of the self, then it is matter of a personality that is more complete than the ego, because the ego is only consists of what you are conscious of.
Yes, yes. Your awareness.
Yeah, what you know to be yourself. Yes. The whole personality of man is indescribable.
Yes.
His consciousness can be described. His unconscious cannot be described, because the unconscious, as I must repeat myself, is always unconscious.
Yes.
And it is really unconscious, but really does not know it.
Does not know about it.
And so we don't know our unconscious personality. We have hints, we have certain ideas, but we don't know it really. Nobody can say where man ends. And that is the beauty of it, you know. Yeah. It's very interesting. Yeah. The unconscious of man can reach God knows where. There we are going to make discoveries.
Yes, yes. Now, another set of ideas center around the terms introversion and extroversion.
It's simply practical, because there are certain people who definitely are more influenced by their surroundings than by their own intentions, while there are other people who are more influenced by the subjective factor. Now you see, the subjective factor, that's very characteristic, was understood by Freud as a sort of pathological autoerotism.
Yes, yes.
Now this is a mistake. You know, we have, the psyche has two conditions, two important conditions. The one is the environmental influence,
yes, yes.
And the other is the given fact of the psyche as it is born. The psyche is by no means tabula rasa. We are a definite mixture and combination of genes,
yeah.
And they are there from the very first moment of our life. And they give a definite character, even to the little child. And that is a subjective factor, looked at from the outside. Now, if you look at it from the inside,
yes,
then it is just so as if you would observe the world.
yes.
When you observe the world, you see houses, you see the sky, you see tangible objects. But when you observe yourself within, you see moving images.
Yes.
A world of images.
Yes.
Generally known as fantasies.
Fantasies.
Yet these fantasies are facts. It is a fact that a man has such and such a fantasy. And it is such a tangible fact, for instance, that when a man has a certain fantasy, another man may lose his life.
Yes.
Or a bridge is built.
Yes.
These houses were all fantasies.
Yes.
Everything you do here, all of the
right.
houses, everything was fantasy to begin with. And fantasy has a proper reality. That is not to be forgotten. Fantasy is not nothing. It is, of course, not a tangible object, but it is a fact nevertheless. It is, say, a form of energy.
Yes.
Despite the fact we can't measure it.
Yes.
It is a manifestation of something.
Yes.
And that is a reality. That is just a reality as, for instance, the peace treaty of Versailles or something like that.
Yes.
It is no more. You can't show it.
Yes.
But it has been a fact.
Yes. Yes.
And so the psychical events are facts, are realities. And when you observe the stream of images within, you observe an aspect of the world.
Yes.
Of the world within. Because the psyche, you know, if you understand it as a phenomenon that takes place in so-called living bodies, then it is a quality of matter. As our body consists of matter, we discovered that this matter has another aspect, namely a psychic aspect.
Yes. Yes.
And so it is simply the world from within, seen from within.
Yes.
It is just as if we were seeing into another aspect of matter. And so, you see, the man who is going by the external world, by the influences of the external world, say society or perceptions, sense perceptions, thinks that he is more valid, you know, because this is valid, this is real. And the man who goes by the subjective factor is not valid because subjective factor is nothing. Yeah. No, that man is just as well based because he is bases himself upon the world from within. Yeah. And so he is quite right, even if he says, oh, there is nothing but my fantasy, you know. Yeah. And of course that is the introvert. And that the introvert is always afraid of the external world. He will tell you, when you ask him, he will be apologetic about it. Yeah. He will say, of course, yes, I know only my fantasies. And he has always a resentment. And as the world in general, particularly America, is extroverted like hell, the introvert has no place. Yeah. Yeah. Because he doesn't know that he beholds the world from within. Yeah. And that gives him dignity, and that gives him certainty, because it is, nowadays particularly, the world hangs on a thin thread.
Yeah.
And that is the psyche of man.
Yeah.
Assume that certain fellows in Moscow lose their nerve or their common sense for a bit, and the whole world is in fire and flames.
Yeah, yeah.
You see? It is, nowadays we are not threatened by elementary catastrophes. There is no such thing as an H-bomb.
Yeah.
That is all man's doing.
Yeah.
We are the great danger. The psyche is the great danger. What if something goes wrong with the psyche?
Yeah. Yeah.
You see? And so you see, it is demonstrated to us in our days what the power of the psyche is of man, how important it is to know something about it, but we know nothing about it. Nobody would give credit to the idea that the psychical processes of the ordinary man have any importance whatever. One thinks, oh, he has just what he has in his head. It is all from his surrounding. He's taught such a thing, believes such a thing. And particularly if he's well housed and well fed, then he has no ideas at all. Yeah. And that's the great mistake.
Yeah.
Because he is just that as which he is born, and he is not born as tabula rasa, but as a reality.
Would you perceive the world being made up of only people or extreme introverts and people that are extreme extroverts?
Well, you know, Bismarck once said, God may protect me against my friends. With my enemies, I can deal myself alone. You know how people are. They catch a word, and then everything is schematized along that word. There is no such thing as a pure extrovert or a pure introvert. You know, that such a man would be in the lunatic asylum. Those are only terms to designate a certain penchant, a certain tendency. For instance, the tendency to be more influenced by environmental influences or more influenced by the subjective factor. That's all.
Yes.
And you see, there are people who are very well balanced and are just as much influenced from within as they are from without, or just as little.
Yes, yes.
And so with all the finer classifications, you know, they are only sort of point de repère, points for orientation. My whole scheme of typology is merely a sort of orientation. Namely, there is such a factor as introversion, there is such a factor as extroversion. The classification of individuals means nothing at all. This is only the instrumentarium for the practical psychologist to explain, for instance, a husband to a wife, or for instance, it is very often the case, one could almost say, it is almost the rule, but I don't want to make too many rules in order not to be schematic, that an introvert marries an extrovert for compensation, or another type marries the counter type to complement himself, for instance.
Well, Dr. Jung, of course, tied in with your typology and quotation version, we, of course, know of your concepts of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition.
Well, there is quite a simple explanation of these terms, and it shows at the same time how I arrived at such a typology. Namely, sensation tells you that there is something. Thinking, roughly speaking, tells you what it is. Feeling tells you whether it is agreeable or not, to be accepted or not, accepted or rejected.
Yes.
And intuition, now there is a difficulty.
Yes.
you don't know ordinarily how intuition works. So when a man has a hunch, you can't tell exactly who he got at that hunch or where that hunch comes from. It is something funny about intuition. I will tell you a little story. I had two patients. The man was a sensation type, and the woman was an intuitive type. Of course, they felt attraction. And so they took a little boat and went out to the Lake of Zurich. And there were those birds that dive off the fish, you know.
Yeah.
And then after a certain time they come up again, and you can't tell where they come up. And so they began to bet who was the first to see the bird. Now, you would think that the one who observes reality very carefully, the sensation type, would of course win out.
Yeah.
Not at all. The woman won the bet completely.
Yeah.
She was beating him on all points.
Yeah.
Because by intuition she knew it before.
I see.
Now, how is that possible?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes, you know, you can really find out how it works by finding the intermediate links. You see, it is a perception by intermediate links, and you only get the result of that whole chain of associations.
Yes.
Sometimes you succeed in finding out, but more often you don't. So my definition is, intuition is a perception by ways or means of the unconscious.
Yes.
That is as near as I can get. This is a very important function, because when you live under primitive conditions, a lot of unpredictable things are likely to happen.
Yes.
And there you need your intuition, because you cannot possibly tell by your perceptions, by your sense perceptions, what there is going to happen.
For example, more specifically, what would be an example or a difference between an intuitive extrovert and an intuitive introvert?
Well, you know, you have chosen a somewhat difficult case, you know, because one of the most difficult types is the intuitive introvert.
Yeah,
you know.
I have.
The intuitive extrovert, you find among hunters, bankers, gamblers.
Yes.
That is quite understandable.
Yes.
But the introvert the introverted variety is more difficult, because he has intuitions as to the subjective factor, namely the inner world.
Yes.
And of course that is now very difficult to understand, because what he sees are most uncommon things, and he doesn't like to talk of them.
Yes.
If he's not a fool, because he would spoil his own game by telling what he sees, because people won't understand it.
Yes.
For instance, once I had a patient, a young woman, about 27 or 8, and her first words were, when I had seated her, she said, "You know, doctor, I come to you because I have a snake in my abdomen." I said, "What?" Yes, a snake, a black snake, coiled up right in the bottom of my abdomen. And I must have made a rather bewildered face at her. And she said, "You know, I don't mean it literally, but I should say it was a snake. It was a snake." Now, you see, our further conversation a little later was that she said, that was about in the middle of our treatment that only lasted for 10 consultations. She had foretold me, "I come 10 times, and then it's all right." I said, "How do you know?" "Oh, I got a hunch," she said.
Yeah.
And really, about the 5th or 6th hour, she said, Doctor, I must tell you, the stake has risen. It is now about here. Punch. And then on the 10th day, I say, now, this is our last hour. And do you feel cured? And she said, beaming, she said, you know, this morning, it came up and came out of my mouth, and the head was golden. And those were her last words. Now, you see, that same girl, when it comes to reality, she came to me because she couldn't hear the step of her feet anymore.
Yeah.
Because she walked on air.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
She couldn't hear it, and that frightened her. And when she came to me, I asked her for her address. And then she said, oh, pension so-and-so. Well, it is not just called pension, but it is a sort of pension. And it is, I never had heard of it.
Yeah.
And I said, now, I'm curious, I never have heard of that place. Well, it's a very nice place, he said. Curious enough, there are only young girls there, very nice and very lively young girls. And they have a merry time. I often wish they would invite me to their merry evenings. And I said, but do they amuse themselves all alone? Said, oh no, there are plenty of young gentlemen coming in, and they have a beautiful time, but they never invite me. It turned out that it was a private brother.
Yes.
And she was a perfectly decent girl, you know, of a very good family, not from here. She had found that place, I don't know how. And she was utterly unaware that those were all prostitutes. I said, for heaven's sake, you fell into a very dark place. You hastened to get out of it. You see, that was her sensation.
Yeah.
She didn't see reality.
Yeah.
But she had hunches like anything, and they came off.
Yeah.
Now, you see, such a person cannot possibly speak of her experiences.
Yes.
Because everybody would think she's absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
I myself was quite shocked when I thought, for heaven's sake, is that case a schizophrenia?
Yes. Yeah.
Because you don't hear that kind of speech.
Right.
But she assumed that the old man, of course, knows everything, and he even doesn't understands such kind of language.
Yeah.
So you see, if when the intuitive, the introverted intuitive would speak what he really perceives, then practically nobody would understand it. He would be misunderstood, and so they learn to keep things to themselves. And you hardly ever hear them talking of these things. That is a great disadvantage, but it is an enormous advantage in another way. Not to speak of the experience they gather in that respect, but also in human relations. For instance, they come into the presence of somebody they don't know, and certainly they have inner images. And those inner images give them a more or less complete information about the psychology of the partner.
Yes. Yes.
You know, that is, but the case can also happen that they come into the presence of somebody whom they don't know at all, not from Adam, and they know an important piece out of the biography of that person.
Yes. Yes.
And are not aware of it, and tell the story.
Yes.
And then the fat is in the fire.
Yeah, that's right.
You see, so the introverted intuitive has in a way a very difficult life, although one of the most interesting lives.
Yes.
But it is difficult often to get into their confidence. It's just a sort of a skeleton to which you have to add the flesh, or say it is a country mapped out, you know, by triangulation points. And that doesn't mean the country consists of triangulation points.
Yes.
That is only in order to have an idea of the distances.
Yes.
And so it is a means to an end. It only makes sense, such a scheme, when you deal with practical cases. Well, I told you that case of that intuitive girl, who suddenly came out with the statement that she had a black snake in the bed. Well, now, that is a collective symbol. That is not an individual fantasy. That is a collective fantasy.
Collective,
That is well known in India. For instance, she has nothing to do with India, but we have it too, which is generally human. But it's entirely unknown. So that I, even in the first moment, thought, perhaps she's crazy. But she was only highly intuitive. It is in India known. It is the basis of a whole philosophical system of Tantrism. This is Kundalini. Kundalini serpent.
I see.
You see? And that is something known to some few specialists. Generally, it's not known that we have a serpent in the abdomen. But that is a collective, you see, that is a collective dream or a collective fantasy. It may be, you know, that what the unconscious has to say is so disagreeable that one prefers not to listen. And in most cases, people would be probably less neurotic if they could admit the things, because these things are always a bit difficult or disagreeable or inconvenient or something of the sort. So there is always a certain amount of repression, but that is not the main thing. The main thing is that they are really unconscious. And you see, if you are unconscious about certain things that ought to be conscious, then you are dissociated. And then you are a man whose left hand never knows what the right is doing. And counteracts or interferes with the right hand. Now such a man is hampered all over the place. Then we have the problem. That is the problem for an intellectual man. And then I say, now, you see, you don't know, you have no answer. I have no answer. Now what are we going to do? I say, now we must see what you dream. Because the dream is a manifestation of the unconscious side. Now he never has heard of the unconscious side. So I must explain to him that he has an unconscious, and that the dream is a manifestation of it. And if we succeed in analyzing the dream, we might get an idea about that power that makes him think like that.
I see.
In treatment, for instance, in the treatment of neurosis, you have to do with that personal unconscious for quite a while. And then only dreams come that show that the collective unconscious is touched upon. Now, as long as there is material for personal nature, you have to deal with the personal unconscious. But when you get to, say, to a question, to a problem, which is no more merely personal, but also collective. You get collective dreams. And then we are there where we can begin with the observation of the unconscious. And then, day by day, one goes on by the data the unconscious produces. You see, we discuss the dream, and that gives a new surface to the whole problem. And he will have another dream, and the next dream gives again an answer, because the unconscious is in a compensated relation to consciousness. And after a while we get the full picture. And if he has the full picture and has the necessary moral stamina, well, then he can be cured.
I see.
But in the end it is a moral question whether a man applies what he had learned or not. There is a sort of typical way in which the integration of consciousness takes place. Namely, the average way is that through the analysis of dreams, for instance, you become acquainted with the contents of the unconscious. I already told you this to begin with, all personal material.
Yes.
Subjective questions, questions of the individual's difficulties in adapting to environmental conditions, and so on.
Yes.
Now, it is a regular observation that when you talk to an individual, and this individual gives you insight into its inner preoccupations, interests, emotions, in other words, hands over his personal complexes, then you get slowly and nilly-willy into the situation of a sort of authority.
Yeah.
A point of, you become a point of reference. You know you are in possession of all the important items in a person's development. I remember, for instance, I analyzed a very well-known American politician, and he told me, oh, any amount of the secrets of his trade. And suddenly he jumped up and said, by God, what have I done? You know, you get $1 million for what I have told you now. I said, well, I'm not interested. You can sleep in peace, I shall not betray you. I forget it within a fortnight. Now, you see, that shows that the things people hand out are not merely indifferent things. When it comes to something important, emotionally important, then they hand out themselves. They hand out a big emotional value, as if they were handing over a large sum, as if they were trusting you with the administration of their estate.
Yes.
And they're entirely in your hands.
Yes.
Often, you know, I hear things that could ruin those people utterly if it's publicly known. Or it would give me, if I should have any blackmailing tendencies, unlimited power to blackmail them. Now, you see, that creates an emotional relationship to the analyst. And that is what Freud called the transference.
Yes.
Which is a central problem of analytic psychology. It is just so as if these people had handed out their whole existence, and that can have very peculiar effects upon the individual. Either they hate you for it or they love you for it. Yeah. But you are not indifferent to them. And there is then a sort of emotional relation between the patient and the doctor.
Yes.
Now, you know, when you hand out such materials, then these contents are associated with all the important persons in the life of a patient. Now, the most important persons are usually father and mother.
Yeah.
That comes up from childhood. The first troubles are with the parents as a rule. So, in handing over your infantile memories about the father or about the mother, you hand over also the image of father and mother. Then it is just as if the doctor had taken the place of the father, yeah, even of the mother. I had quite a number of male patients that called me Mother Jung. Because they handed over the mother to me.
Yes, yes.
Curiously enough.
Yes.
But you see, that's quite irrespective of the personality of the analyst. It is simply disregarded. He functions as if he were the mother, or he functions as if he were the father, the central authority. And now that is what one calls transference. That's a case, a particular case of of projection.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
Freud doesn't exactly call it projection; he calls it transference.
Yes.
That is an allusion to the old and superstitious idea of handing over a disease,
yes.
transferring a disease upon an animal, or handing over the sin upon a scapegoat, and the scapegoat takes it out into the desert and makes it disappear.
Yes, yes.
So they hand over themselves in the hope that I can swallow that stuff and digest it for them. And so I am in loca patis and have a high authority. Naturally, I'm also persecuted by the correspondent resistances, by all the manifold emotional reactions they have had against their parents. Now, that is the stuff you have to work through first in analyzing the situation, because a patient in such a condition is not free. He is the slave. He's utterly dependent upon the doctor, like a patient with an open abdomen on the operation table.
Yes.
He is in the hands of the surgeon for better or worse. And so the thing must be finished. And so we had to work through that condition in the hope that we arrive in a situation where the patient is able to see that I'm not the father or not the mother, that I am an ordinary human being. Now, everybody naturally should assume that such a thing would be possible. For instance, that a patient could arrive at such an insight when he's not a complete idiot, that I am just a doctor and not the emotional figure of their fantasies. But that is very often not the case. So I had a case that was an intelligent young woman. She was a student of philosophy, very good mind, where one could expect easily that she would see that I am not the parental authority. But she was utterly unable to get out of this delusion. And in such a case, one always has recourse to the dreams. It is just as if one would ask the unconscious, now what do you say to such a condition? You see, she says within the unconscious, of course I know you are not my father, but I just feel like that, it is like that, I depend upon you. And I say, now we will see what the unconscious says. Now the unconscious produces dreams in which I really assume a very curious role. You know, she was a little infant, she was sitting on my knees, I held her in my arms, I was a very tender father to the little girl, you know, and more, her dreams became emphatic in that respect, namely that I was a sort of giant, and she is a very little, frail human thing, you know, and quite a little girl in the hands of an enormous being. And the last dream of that series was, I cannot tell you all the dreams, was that it was out in nature. I stood in a field of wheat, an enormous field of wheat that was ripe for harvest. And I was a giant. And I held her in my arm like a baby. And the wind was blowing over that field of wheat. Now, you know, when the wind is blowing over wheat field, these waves in the wheat field.
Yes, yes.
And with these waves, I swayed like that, putting her as if it were to sleep, you know. And she felt as being in the arms of the Godhead.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, now the harvest is ripe.
Yes.
And I must tell her. And I told her, you see, what you want and what you project into me, because you are not conscious of it, is you have the idea of a deity. You don't possess. Therefore you see it in me.
Yes.
That clicked. Because, you know, she had a rather intense religious education. Of course, it all vanished later on.
Yeah.
And something disappeared from her world. The world became merely personal, and that religious conception of the world was non-existent, apparently. But you see, the idea of a deity is not an intellectual idea. It is an archetype. It's an archetypal idea. Therefore, you find it practically everywhere under this or another name. You know, even if it has the name mana, it is an all-powerful, extraordinary effect or quality, even if it's not personal at all. And so she suddenly became aware of an entirely heathenish image.
Yes.
That comes fresh from the archetype. She had not the idea of a Christian God or of an Old Testament Yahweh. It was a heathenish God, you see, a God of nature, of vegetation. He was the wheat himself. He is the spirit of the wheat, the spirit of the wind. And she was in the arms of that Noumen. No. Now, that is the living experience of an archetype. Now, that made a tremendous impression upon that girl, and instantly it clicked. She saw what she really was missing, that missing value, that was in the form of a projection in myself and made myself indispensable to her.
Yes.
And then she saw it is not indispensable, because it is, as the dream says, she is in the arms of that archetypal idea. Now that is a luminous experience, you see. And that is the thing that people are looking for.
Yes.
An archetypal experience that gives them an incorruptible value, and that is a sort of liberation.
Yeah.
And that is, of course, makes her complete, you know. Inasmuch as she can realize such a luminous experience, she is able to continue her path, her way, her individuation. The acorn can become an oak and not a donkey. Nature will take her course. She will become that which she is from the beginning. Now, we think we are able to be born today and to live in no myth, without history. That is a disease. That's absolutely abnormal, because man is not born every day. He is once born in a specific historical setting with the specific historical qualities, and therefore he is only complete when he has a relation to these things. It is just as if you were born without eyes and ears, when you are growing up with no connection with the past. From the standpoint of natural science, you need no connection with the past. You can wipe it out.
Yes, yes.
And that is a mutilation of the human being. Now I saw, through my practical experience, that this kind of proceeding had a most extraordinary therapeutical effect. And so you see, in our days, we have such and such view of the world, such and such a philosophy, but in the unconscious we have a different one. And that we can see through the example of the alchemistic philosophy that behaves towards the medieval consciousness exactly like the unconscious behaves to ourselves. And we can construct or even predict our the unconscious of our days when we know what it has been yesterday. Now that is, with a few words, the development of my ideas.
Coge esto primero. Ni introducción, ni pollas al final. A ver, por favor, ¿puede venir alguien? Esto está lleno de agua, hostia puta. No, aquí no filmamos nada más, se ha acabado ya. Venís a mi casa y todo lleno de mierda. Vale, ya está, tomar por culo, se ha acabado.